Mary Jones's heart surgery was going smoothly until something unexpected happened. Her heart rate suddenly dropped. The machine started beeping loudly, and everyone in the operating room became tense. Dr. Smith stayed calm. Too calm, as if he had seen this before. "Her heart is failing," he announced, but his voice didn't show any worry. Nurse Wilson noticed that he hadn't called for the usual emergency medicines right away. In the next few minutes, the operating room turned into a busy scene. Nurses ran around following Dr. Smith's orders, but something felt off. When he finally asked for medicine to help Mary's heart, he picked an unusual one. Nurse Wilson had worked with him for 5 years, and this wasn't his normal way of handling problems. She kept quiet, but she wrote everything down in her notes. Something she had started doing lately because of other strange things she had seen. Meanwhile, Officer Brown was driving fast to City Hospital. As she drove, she thought about all the dead patients' files on her desk. Each patient had died in a different way, but there was one thing that connected them. They all had cheap surgeries from famous doctors. It seemed too good to be true, and now she wondered if it was. Her phone rang. It was Dr. Mike Lee again. "Susan," he said, sounding worried. "I found the same strange chemical in 3 other patients' blood. Someone's been poisoning them slowly during their surgeries." Back in the operating room, Mary's condition got worse. Dr. Smith worked quickly, his hands moving fast over her open chest. Sweat appeared on his forehead for the first time anyone could remember. The heart monitor kept making warning sounds. "We're losing her," a young doctor said. But just then, Dr. Smith did something unusual. He used a special tool that wasn't normally needed for this kind of surgery. Nurse Wilson watched as he put something near Mary's heart. Later, she would wish she had spoken up at that moment. In the hospital lobby, Officer Brown showed her badge to the front desk. She asked where Dr. Smith was operating. Just then, a loud emergency call came through the hospital speakers. "Code blue in operating room 3, code blue in operating room 3. That was where Mary Jones was having her surgery. Officer Brown started running, but she knew she couldn't go into an operating room during surgery. She would have to wait outside, hoping she wasn't too late. Dr. Smith worked for 20 more minutes on Mary Jones. Finally, he stepped back and said, "Time of death, 2:45 p.m. The room was quiet except for the flat sound of the heart monitor. Everyone looked sad, but Dr. Smith's face showed no emotion. He took off his surgical gloves, dropped them in the trash, and walked toward the door. As he opened it, he saw Officer Brown standing there with 2 other police officers. Their faces told him they knew something. For the first time in 15 years, Dr. Smith's perfect mask started to crack. Officer Brown sat across from Dr. Smith in a small hospital meeting room. His white coat was still on, and a little spot of blood showed on the sleeve. 2 other police officers stood by the door. "Dr. Smith," Officer Brown started, "can you tell me about your last 5 patients who died?" Dr. Smith smiled politely, but his hands were shaking under the table. "They were all very sick people," he said. "Sometimes we can't save everyone." While they talked, Nurse Wilson was doing something important. She had quietly gone back to the operating room where Mary Jones died. Something about that special tool Dr. Smith had used bothered her. She found it in the medical waste bin, wrapped it in a clean cloth, and put it in a plastic bag. Her hands trembled as she wrote evidence on the bag. She had worked with Dr. Smith for years, but now she remembered all the times things hadn't seemed quite right. At the police station, young Officer Tim Parker was going through Dr. Smith's background. He found something strange. Before coming to City Hospital, Dr. Smith had worked at 5 other hospitals in different cities. At each hospital, patients had died in unusual ways. But because he was such a famous doctor, no one had questioned him. Officer Parker picked up his phone to call Officer Brown with the news. Back in the meeting room, Officer Brown's phone buzzed. She looked at the message from Officer Parker, and her face changed. Dr. Smith noticed this and started to sweat. "Dr. Smith," she said, "why did you leave Central Hospital in 2019? Before he could answer, there was a knock at the door. It was Nurse Wilson with the plastic bag. Dr. Smith's face went white when he saw what was inside it. Just then, Dr. Mike Lee rushed into the room. He was holding papers in his hands. "The chemical we found," he said, breathing hard. "It's a special kind of poison. It makes it look like the heart failed naturally. And I just found out. It's only available to top heart surgeons." Everyone looked at Dr. Smith. His perfect doctor image was falling apart in front of their eyes. Officer Brown laid out some papers on the table. "You charge less than other doctors for your surgeries," she said. "But each patient's insurance still paid out a lot of money when they died. The money went to different bank accounts, but they all lead back to you." Dr. Smith's hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely hold his water glass. Nurse Wilson stepped forward. "Ooh, there's more," she said. "I've been keeping notes. Every patient who died had the same pattern. Dr. Smith would use that special tool, the one I just found. He must have been using it to inject the poison near their hearts." Dr. Smith suddenly stood up, knocking his chair over. But the police officers were quick to grab him before he could run. As the police officers put handcuffs on Dr. Smith, a small notebook fell from his coat pocket. Officer Brown picked it up and opened it. Inside were neat rows of names and dates, dozens of them, far more than they had known about. Each name had a number next to it. She realized with horror that these were money amounts, showing how much he had made from each death. But there was something else strange in the notebook. A date marked in red, October 15th, 2018. The day everything had changed. While Dr. Smith was taken to the police station, Officer Brown and Nurse Wilson went through his office. Behind his medical awards and certificates, they found a hidden safe. It took the police an hour to open it. Inside, they found more than just money. There were old newspapers from 2018. The main story was about a woman named Linda Smith, Dr. Smith's wife. She had died during a heart surgery at another hospital. The doctor who operated on her had charged a very high price, but couldn't save her. At the police station, Officer Tim Parker was looking through Dr. Smith's computer files. He found emails between Dr. Smith and expensive heart surgeons from 2018. In the emails, Dr. Smith had begged them to lower their prices for his wife's surgery. They had all said no. The last email was from the doctor who finally did Linda's surgery. He had written, "If you can't afford the best care, you should try somewhere cheaper." 1 week after Linda died, the first patient on Dr. Smith's list had died. Officer Brown sat down again with Dr. Smith in a small room at the police station. This time, his neat appearance was gone. His white coat was wrinkled, and his eyes were red. "Tell me about Linda," Officer Brown said softly. Dr. Smith's hands stopped shaking for the first time. He looked up, and tears filled his eyes. "They let her die because we didn't have enough money," he whispered. "Those doctors with their high prices. They think they're gods. I wanted to show them what happens when a good doctor goes bad." Meanwhile, Nurse Wilson was helping other police officers find more victims. She remembered all the times Dr. Smith had offered to help poor families by lowering his prices. Everyone had thought he was being kind. Now they knew he was choosing his victims, people who reminded him of his wife, people who couldn't afford expensive doctors. Each death was his revenge against the medical system he blamed for Linda's death. Back at City Hospital, the emergency room was getting busy. News about Dr. Smith had spread, and people were coming in worried about their family members who had been his patients. Dr. Mike Lee and his team worked fast to test blood samples from recent patients. They found 5 more people with traces of the poison in their blood. These patients were still alive, but they would need special treatment to survive. Officer Brown looked at the growing wall of evidence in the police station. Pictures of victims, bank statements, and medical records covered every inch. In the middle was the photo of Linda Smith, smiling in her hospital gown just before her surgery. Next to it was Dr. Smith's medical license, the one that had let him hide his deadly revenge behind a surgeon's mask for so long. The next morning, all the newspapers had Dr. Smith's face on the front page. The headlines read, "Trusted Doctor Turns Killer." People couldn't believe that someone they had trusted so much could do such terrible things. At City Hospital, workers were taking down his awards and pictures from the walls. Some nurses were crying, remembering how they had helped him during the surgeries without knowing what he was really doing. More families started coming forward. They brought pictures of their loved ones who had died after Dr. Smith's surgeries. Officer Brown set up a special room at the police station just to talk to these families. Each story was sadder than the last. One old man brought a thank you card he had sent to Dr. Smith after his wife's surgery. "He seemed so kind," the man cried. "He even helped us with the insurance papers after she died." Now they knew why. Dr. Smith had been making sure he got paid extra money when his patients died. Dr. Mike Lee worked day and night testing blood samples. He found out something that gave people hope. The poison Dr. Smith used took time to work. If they caught it early, they could save people. The hospital started calling all of Dr. Smith's patients who were still alive. Many needed to come back for special treatment. Police officers helped track down patients who had moved to other cities. In his jail cell, Dr. Smith started writing in a new notebook. He wrote down every patient he had killed, starting with the first one after his wife died. The list went on for pages. When Officer Brown read it, she found out that some deaths they hadn't even known about. Dr. Smith wrote about how he chose his victims. People who reminded him of Linda, people struggling to pay medical bills, people who trusted him to make things better. Nurse Wilson found it hard to sleep at night. She kept thinking about all the times she could have noticed something wrong. One memory kept coming back, a day when Dr. Smith had cried in the break room. Everyone thought he was sad about losing a patient. Now she realized it had been on Linda's birthday. He had killed 2 patients that day. At the police station, Officer Tim Parker made a big map showing all the hospitals where Dr. Smith had worked. At each one, he had stayed just long enough not to raise suspicion. He always left before anyone could notice the pattern of deaths. But he made one mistake. He kept everything in his notebook. Each death, each payment, each step of his plan to get back at the medical system that had failed his wife. The story got bigger when Officer Brown found something new in Dr. Smith's emails. He had been writing to the doctor who operated on Linda. Every time Dr. Smith killed a patient, he sent an anonymous email to that doctor telling him about another death caused by expensive medical care. The other doctor never knew these emails were coming from Dr. Smith. Now, sitting in his expensive office in another city, that doctor was reading the news about Dr. Smith with a pale face. 2 weeks after Dr. Smith's arrest, the police found something unexpected in his house. Behind a loose brick in the basement, they discovered Linda's old diary. Officer Brown stayed up all night reading it. The diary told a sad story. Linda had been sick for a long time, and she and Dr. Smith had sold their house and car to pay for treatments. But it still wasn't enough. The last entry was written the night before her surgery. She had written, "Tom blames himself for not being a more successful doctor. I keep telling him it's not his fault." At the courthouse, lawyers were getting ready for the biggest medical crime trial in the city's history. Dr. Smith sat in his prison cell, now looking much older than his 45 years. He agreed to tell the whole truth, but only if Officer Brown would listen to his story first. After Linda died, he told her, "I worked extra hours to become the best heart surgeon. I wanted to show those expensive doctors that skill wasn't about money. But then I saw how the system kept hurting poor families, just like it hurt Linda. Something broke inside me." Nurse Wilson was asked to testify in court. She brought all her notes and the special tool she had found. More nurses from other hospitals came forward too. They all told similar stories. How Dr. Smith would arrive at a new hospital, build trust, then start offering cheaper surgeries to struggling families. One nurse remembered him saying, "Everyone deserves the best care no matter how much money they have." Now, those words had a darker meaning. Officer Tim Parker made an important discovery while checking bank records. The money Dr. Smith got from his victims' insurance didn't all go to him. He had been sending half of it to a charity that helps poor people pay for heart surgeries. The charity didn't know the money came from killing patients. In Dr. Smith's notebook, he had written next to these payments, "Linda would have wanted to help them." Dr. Mike Lee found more evidence in the medical supplies. The poison Dr. Smith used was actually a combination of 3 different medicines. Mixed together, they looked like normal heart medicine. Dr. Smith had been very clever. He ordered small amounts from different suppliers so no one would notice. But he made one mistake. He always ordered them right before choosing a new victim. The local TV news interviewed Linda's sister, Mary. She cried as she talked about how Dr. Smith changed after Linda died. He stopped smiling, stopped going to family dinners, she said. He said he was busy helping people who couldn't afford good doctors. We thought he was being a hero. We never knew he was getting revenge. She brought an old photo of Dr. Smith and Linda on their wedding day. In it, he looked happy and kind. Nothing like the cold-faced man now sitting in jail. Officer Brown put all the pieces together for the court case. Dr. Smith had killed 27 people in 5 years. Each victim got cheaper surgery because they couldn't afford normal prices. He made sure they all had good insurance that would pay extra if they died. Half the money went to his secret charity, and half went to his bank account. He kept perfect records of everything, like he was running a deadly business. The notebook showed he had planned to kill 3 more patients before moving to another hospital. The first day of the trial brought hundreds of people to the courthouse. Families of Dr. Smith's victims sat on one side of the room. On the other side sat doctors and nurses from all the hospitals where he had worked. Dr. Smith walked in wearing an orange prison uniform instead of his white doctor's coat. He looked straight ahead, not meeting anyone's eyes. Officer Brown was the first person to speak at the trial. She showed the jury everything they had found: the notebook, the poison bottles, the special tool, and Linda's diary. When she read parts of Linda's diary out loud, Dr. Smith finally showed emotion. He put his head in his hands and cried. The jury members looked at each other, surprised to see the cold-hearted killer break down. Next, Nurse Wilson told the court about Mary Jones's last surgery. Her voice shook as she described how Dr. Smith had used the special tool to inject the poison. "We trusted him," she said. "He was teaching young doctors how to be good surgeons, all while he was killing patients." Some of the young doctors in the courtroom looked sick as they realized they had learned surgery from a murderer. Then something unexpected happened. The doctor who had operated on Linda came to testify. He looked nervous as he read all the anonymous emails Dr. Smith had sent him. "Each email told me about another person who died because they couldn't afford good care," he said. "I never knew these emails were coming from Dr. Smith. Now, I understand. He was showing me how many people die when doctors charge too much money." The most powerful moment came when they played a video from Dr. Smith's office. It was a recording of him talking to a poor family, telling them he would do their mother's surgery for half price. In the video, the family hugged him and called him an angel. The same family was now in the courtroom, crying as they watched. Their mother had been victim number 20. Dr. Mike Lee showed the jury how the poison worked. He had made a chart that was easy to understand. The poison looked like normal heart medicine, but over a few days, it would slowly stop the heart. Dr. Smith knew exactly what he was doing, Dr. Lee said. He chose a poison that would kill people slowly, so no one would suspect murder. Officer Tim Parker shared his investigation of the charity where Dr. Smith sent money. The charity had used the money to help 50 poor patients get heart surgery. These patients had lived because they got good care. Dr. Smith was playing God, Parker said. He decided who would live and who would die. He killed 27 people, but saved 50 others with their insurance money. At the end of the day, Dr. Smith asked to speak. The room went completely quiet. I became the thing I hated most, he said slowly. I wanted to show how unfair the medical system was, how it kills poor people by charging too much. But I turned into someone who killed poor people myself. Linda would be ashamed of what I became. As he spoke these words, Linda's sister Mary walked out of the courtroom, unable to listen anymore. The trial lasted for 3 weeks. On the final day, the courtroom was so full that some people had to stand. Before the jury gave their decision, more secrets about Dr. Smith came out. A nurse from his first hospital brought in old security videos. They showed Dr. Smith sitting by Linda's empty hospital bed late at night, long after she died. In the videos, he was wearing his doctor's coat and talking to her picture, promising to fix the system that killed her. Officer Brown had one last piece of evidence. She found a letter in Dr. Smith's house that he had never sent. It was written to Linda on what would have been their 20th wedding anniversary. "My darling Linda," it said, "I tried to change things, but I became a monster instead. Every time I killed someone, I told myself it was for you. But you would have hated what I've done. You always said doctors should heal, not hurt." When the jury announced their decision, no one was surprised. Dr. Smith was guilty of killing 27 people. The judge gave him a life sentence for each death. But before going to prison, Dr. Smith asked to speak one last time. His hands were shaking again, just like that morning when he walked into City Hospital for the last time. "I was once a good doctor," he said, looking at all the families in the room. "I saved lives. But when the system let Linda die because we couldn't pay, something in me died too. I thought I could force changes by showing how unfair everything was. Instead, I became worse than the doctors I hated. To all the families here, I know sorry isn't enough, but I am sorry. I killed your loved ones to prove a point. But the only thing I proved was that revenge can turn a healer into a killer." The case changed things in big ways. City Hospital started a new program to help poor patients pay for surgery. They named it the Linda Smith Program, which made Dr. Smith cry when he heard about it in prison. Other hospitals around the country started similar programs. Linda's doctor quit his private practice and started working at a charity hospital, helping people who couldn't afford care. Nurse Wilson never went back to the operating room. Instead, she started teaching nurses how to spot signs when something's wrong. She used Dr. Smith's case to show them that even trusted doctors can do bad things. "We have to watch out for our patients," she would say. "They trust us with their lives." Officer Brown kept Linda's diary. Sometimes she would read it to remind herself why this case mattered so much. The last page had a photo of Dr. Smith and Linda dancing at their wedding. On the back, Linda had written, "Tom always says a doctor's job is to save everyone, no matter how much money they have." Those words now hung in the entrance of City Hospital's new free clinic. Dr. Smith was sent to a prison far from the city. In his cell, he kept only one thing, his old doctor name badge, but he hung it facing the wall so he couldn't see his own face. Every night, he wrote in a new diary, telling Linda how her death had turned him from a healer into a killer, and every night he ended with the same words, "I tried to fix a broken system, but I only broke myself instead." 1 year after Dr. Smith went to prison, City Hospital looked very different. Signs for the Linda Smith program were everywhere, showing prices that everyone could afford. The waiting room had a wall with pictures of smiling patients who got help from the program. Next to it hung Linda's last school photo, where she worked as a teacher before getting sick. Below it was a sign that said, "Everyone deserves care." Officer Brown kept following the changes Dr. Smith's case caused. She started giving talks at police training schools about how to spot hidden crimes in hospitals. Sometimes the hardest criminals to catch are the ones everyone trusts, she would tell new officers. She kept the old evidence box in her office to remind herself that evil can hide behind a kind face. Dr. Mike Lee made big changes in how hospitals check medicines. He created a new system that tracked every drop of medicine in the hospital. Nurses had to scan everything before giving it to patients. Dr. Smith taught us that we can't just trust people because they wear white coats, he told new hospital workers during training. We have to check everything. Nurse Wilson wrote a book about her time working with Dr. Smith. She called it The Killer I Helped, and it became required reading in nursing schools. In the book, she wrote about all the small signs she had missed, how Dr. Smith always worked alone during the important parts of surgery, how he kept his special tools separate from other equipment, how he picked certain patients who reminded him of Linda. The charity that got money from Dr. Smith's crimes decided to keep helping people instead of closing down. They changed their name to Second Chance Heart Fund and started checking very carefully where donation money came from. They helped twice as many patients now because Dr. Smith's case made more people donate to help poor patients get surgery. Linda's sister Mary started visiting Dr. Smith in prison once a month. At first, she just sat quietly, looking at the man who had loved her sister so much that he became a monster. Later, they started talking about Linda, remembering her kindness and how she always helped others. She would have wanted you to stay good, Mary told him. She never would have wanted revenge. Back at City Hospital, they started a new rule called Linda's Law. It said that no patient could be turned away because they couldn't pay. Other hospitals across the country started following this rule too. Rich doctors who used to charge very high prices started offering lower prices for poor patients. They didn't want to be seen as the kind of doctors who had driven Dr. Smith to become a killer. Even in prison, Dr. Smith kept helping in his own way. He wrote long letters to medical schools, telling them to teach young doctors about caring for poor patients. "Don't let them become like me," he wrote. "Don't let them think money matters more than lives." Many schools now used his letters to teach students about what can happen when good doctors lose their way. 5 years after Dr. Smith went to prison, Officer Brown visited him one last time. He looked much older now, his hair completely gray. She brought him news about all the changes his case had created. More than 1,000 patients had been saved by the Linda Smith program. Poor families could now get heart surgery without selling their homes or cars. Some of the doctors who used to charge very high prices were now working for free one day each week. Dr. Smith's old office at City Hospital had become a special room where poor families could meet with doctors to talk about payment plans. On the wall hung both Linda's picture and a news article about Dr. Smith's crimes. The hospital used these to teach a simple lesson. Every choice a doctor makes can either save or destroy lives. Nurse Wilson's book had helped catch 2 other doctors who were hurting patients on purpose. Her warning signs list was now part of every hospital's safety rules. Nurses everywhere learned to speak up when they saw something strange, no matter how much they trusted the doctor. "We are the patient's last defense," became a saying among nurses. One day, a surprise letter arrived at the police station. It was from the son of one of Dr. Smith's victims. The young man had become a doctor himself. "I wanted to understand the system that created both my mother's killer and her savior," he wrote. "Dr. Smith was wrong to kill my mother, but he was right about one thing. Healthcare needed to change. I became a doctor to be part of that change." Linda's sister Mary started a support group for families of patients who died because they couldn't afford good care. The group helped push for new laws about hospital prices. They called themselves Linda's Legacy, and their work helped pass laws in many states saying hospitals had to offer fair prices to everyone. Dr. Mike Lee's medicine tracking system spread to hospitals across the world. People called it the Smith check, a sad reminder of why it was needed. Every medicine bottle, every tool, every drop of liquid was now tracked by computer. No doctor could ever again hide poison in normal medicine the way Dr. Smith had done. In his prison cell, Dr. Smith kept writing in his diary to Linda. His last entry said, "My darling, I thought I could fix the broken system that took you from me. Instead, my crimes forced others to fix it. Every patient saved by the changes my evil caused is a reminder of the good doctor I could have stayed. You always said everything happens for a reason. Maybe my fall from grace was meant to lift others up." 10 years after the case ended, City Hospital held a special ceremony. They had helped 10,000 poor patients get heart surgery through the Linda Smith program. Officer Brown, Nurse Wilson, and Dr. Mike Lee were there. So was Mary, Linda's sister. They all stood in front of a new statue in the hospital garden. It showed two hands holding a heart. The words below it read, "In memory of those we lost, and a promise to those we can save." The story of Dr. Smith, the surgeon who hid evil behind his scalpel, changed medicine forever. It taught hospitals that trust must come with checking. It showed doctors that high prices can kill just as surely as poison. But most importantly, it proved that even the darkest acts can lead to light if people learn the right lessons from them.